Welcome to our panel on incident response planning. It's a very non-technical panel this time. What we want to do is walk you...
No! I think that's not a great start. Let's get this fired up. Good. Okay, so I'll kick off. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Perfect. And I'll start the timer just so I don't overrun. So, good morning, folks. Thanks for coming along to my session, which is focused on the challenges that we've had with the COVID pandemic over the last 2 years now, what that means for cybersecurity and what the future challenges might be in that space. So if you haven't met me before, I'm Dr. Lindsay Shepard. I'm from Abertay University up in Dundee. I focus on cybersecurity and human-computer interaction. At the moment, I'm Deputy Lead for Human Interaction and User Experience Research, and I'm in the process of setting up a new research group focused on how people interact with all different sorts of technologies. In terms of my research interests, I really focus on usable security, basically keeping people safe online. There's loads of great security tools out there, but some of them are not very usable for average users. So how do we communicate security risks to average end users? Aside from that, there's other components to my work. So I also focus on eye tracking, which is kind of special devices which can detect where someone's looking on a screen. So for example, if you're designing security warnings and you want to make sure that people have actually seen them, you can run some tests with the eye tracker to see if they've bothered reading them. I also teach web development, so I'm pretty keen on web technologies, and I've also pulled some gamification into my work as well. In terms of research that I've been working on of late, I'm involved with the Foresight project, which is a big European project looking at cyber ranges. So it's pooling 3 cyber ranges or trading platforms together into one big federated platform. And there's, I think, about 26 partners as part of that project, so it's a big one. I'm also involved with Abertay's new cyber quarter. If that's something that you're interested in, if you've already heard about it, or want to know more, please get in touch. I know Cheryl, our business development officer, is also here today. So if you don't get hold of me, get hold of her, and we'll be happy to tell you more and point you in the right direction. Okay? So what am I going to cover in this talk today? So just the overview. Highlight how cyber attacks changed at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's also an overview of all the attacks that took place on UK institutions over a 2-month period just as we went into lockdown. Of course, that had an impact on the workforce, the way we do business. It has implications for the government, businesses, and there's challenges going forward because we haven't gone back to the old way we used to do things. It's all about hybrid working, flexibility, and there will be challenges there. This probably won't be the last pandemic that we face. It won't be the last major challenge that we face. So what can we do going forward? So just to point out that this talk is based around a few bits of research that I've done. Some were with the Scottish Institute for Policing Research, and others were just with my collaborators. If you're interested in any of the papers, give me a shout and I'll pass you a free version. Okay? So we all know how COVID-19 started. It all kind of kicked off around December 2019, and from then on, there was a marked increase in cyber attacks. So there was loads of different scams out there, particularly emails that were impersonating different authorities, so particularly the WHO, for example, because they were in charge of dealing with how the pandemic was handled in the beginning. This was all compounded by the fact that people ended up having to work from home. There were cybersecurity concerns as part of that, which I'll dig into as part of this talk. And that also led to technological challenges due to the rapid adoption of digital technologies. So as part of the cyber attacks, critical infrastructures were attacked. So healthcare services, so in particular the WHO, which was providing initial testing services, they were attacked. There was attacks on the likes of hospitals in Czechoslovakia as well. Of course, this prompted a global response. So just a few examples of the different agencies that were involved in the beginning. So in the UK, the National Cybersecurity Centre, the US and their Department of Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. There was also some groups put together to look at advanced persistent threats as well, to see how they were exploiting the COVID-19 pandemic. And then there's an important part in the bottom that might not seem all that significant. There was lots and lots of smaller scams. So that is titled as volume cybercrime. It's not massive cases, it's little examples, but there's lots of it, and that causes a problem. So the disruption for citizens, obviously you will all have experienced this, change in daily routine. Of course, we went into lockdown. It's, what's the second anniversary today, is it? There was a loss of social interactions, physical activity. People were pretty stressed out and very anxious because we've not really dealt with anything like this before. And that's something which can increase your chances to fall victim to an attack, for example, a phishing attack. There's previous research that's been done that's looked at the time of day that people are more likely to fall victim to a phishing attack at work. And it's usually around 3 in the afternoon when they're a bit tired or they're a bit stressed, they're not thinking as clearly as they would be, coffee's worn off, and that's when they're more likely to click on a phishing link. There was a sudden change of working context as well, so companies had to basically improvise new structures. It was a case of go home and we'll see what we can figure out. So when the UK went into lockdown, that's when we started to see scams and malware attacks, for example, rising significantly here. So looking at the literature that was out there, we found that in March 2020, attacks rose by 600%. So it's not insignificant. The following month, Google blocked 18 million malware and phishing emails related to the virus every day. And it was the volume of reported attacks that prompted us to carry out this research. Because whenever I was online with my collaborators, we were just being bombarded with, yep, here's another attack, this has happened, this has happened. So we wanted to try and get an overview to see what was actually happening. Basically map what was going on. So we decided to try and create a timeline to show how the attacks basically evolved, or when there was surges in attacks. So we went with an initial worldwide timeline, and we started with the date that China alerted the WHO that COVID-19 existed. And that's when some of the worst affected countries went into lockdown, just a few weeks later. We looked at news articles and blogs because this information was far too new to be found in academic journals. We had to consider that what was reported was through a journalistic lens, so it's not academic writing. And we focused on mid-March to mid-May when things began to ease off a bit in 2020. We didn't just stick to using Google, we used Baidu, which is Chinese, Quant, which is French, and DuckDuckGo, which is obviously more privacy focused. We also translated our search terms into different languages just to try and capture as many of the news articles as possible. And we didn't look at articles that were behind paywalls because obviously we couldn't access them. When we categorized our list of cyber attacks to get our overview of what was going on, we basically used the Crime Prosecution Service definitions, which is up there, and I'll dig into that in a bit more detail. So overall, in that time period, we found 43 unique attacks, which doesn't sound like a lot, but there was multiple articles reporting the same attacks. And then we also developed a timeline from what the WHO were reporting, because they've got everything on their website of key dates. So we placed this all onto a timeline, which I don't expect you to be able to read because it's far too small. But what you might notice is the colours. So red indicates a phishing attack, and most of the attacks that you can see mapped on the timeline were phishing related. Green is some aspect of malware that was part of the phishing attack, so you can see that those are quite often paired together, and the dark blue is financial fraud, so they were all part of the same attack. But if we focus just on the UK, and I promise that this timeline's a bit easier to read because there's not as much stuff on it, we find that there was a loose correlation between when the government were making their announcements and then sudden rises in cyber attacks or campaigns. So just to give you a picture, a couple of years ago where we were at, by the start of May, there was 160,000 suspect emails reported to the National Cybersecurity Centre. It was estimated that there was 4.6 million already lost to COVID scams. There was lots of examples of phishing or smishing, so text-based phishing attacks as well. Fake shops selling the likes of masks, and HMRC took down almost 300 fake websites, and that's just in the 2-month period there. So this is our UK timeline. So as you can see, pretty much all of the attacks that we found involving the UK involve some aspect of phishing, paired with financial fraud, which is the dark blue. What you'll see along the bottom is announcements that the government made. So that can be things like when the government announced a job retention scheme, for example, when home testing kits were made available. Criminals exploited various announcements here, basically put new skins on phishing emails and sent them out to try and target people. So this was one of the examples that we found. The government announced that there was relief available for businesses because obviously they were in lockdown, they still needed to pay staff. So the scammers immediately jumped on that with smishing messages. I mean, it looks fairly realistic given some of the text that we were getting during lockdown. Takes you to a fake website and asks for your bank details, basically. There was other pretty awful examples as well. So, for example, I think it was in April, the government announced free school meals for kids. 2 days later, there was fake messages going out asking parents to basically give their bank details so the money for the school meals could be transferred. That's basically picking on the lowest of the low, you know, targeting perhaps the poorest families and their kids. So the criminals weren't really caring who they targeted, they were just exploiting each of the government announcements. Another example here as well, as we went into lockdown, we all got the text saying, you know, you need to stay at home. If you know, it's against the law to leave your home more than once in a day. But some people would have actually had genuine reasons to do that, you know, if they were caring for an elderly relative, for example. If they were getting targeted with these messages, they might think, well, you know, they were panicked, anxious, and think, well, yeah, I did leave my house twice in a day, and they will have fallen victim to this attack. So overall, back to the global timeline, you can see that the vast majority involved phishing or smishing, and some aspect of financial fraud. Of course, that had a huge impact on the workforce. So people spend increased periods of time online. Although things have started to become a bit more normal, we're not back to everybody in the office. Meetings are generally hybrid. There will be still some people that are online all the time. During the pandemic, rates of unemployment climbed as well. There was a risk that those people might then be sitting at home with nothing to do, and they might turn to cybercrime to support themselves. That was a big fear in the beginning. It also impacted how we did our jobs, because when lockdown happened, we basically had to rush home and just had makeshift structures in place. So there's been arguments as well regarding conflicts in terms of security risk. So do you strictly comply with security standards to discourage data sharing, for example, to the point that you can't do your job, or do you open yourself to some risk so you can actually continue your business? There was some technical challenges with data there as well, because you need to adhere to GDPR, consent safety. But if everybody's working from home and they're not all on the corporate network, you don't have that full oversight. So potentially corporate assets are less protected than before. In addition to that, loads of people were asked to download unfamiliar software. I bet a lot of people hadn't heard of Zoom before the pandemic started, and then suddenly everybody was on it. So there's a risk that people aren't familiar with these bits of software, particularly if you're not in our industry, and they might have fallen victim to fake versions of the software, for example. So overall, it's caused major social transformations. As part of that, though, it's impacted online cybercrime and actually how the police will need to deal with that as well. Quite a few slides ago, I mentioned volume cybercrime, that it's a smaller attacks, but there's loads of them that affect local people. How do the police handle that? It's not really a job for the NCA, it's probably for your more local city police, for example. So just to keep an eye on my time. Yeah, I've still got time, all good. So when we went into lockdown, different crimes changed. Obviously, there was fewer shoplifting offences, basically in-person crimes, because people had to stay at home. But fraud sharply rose because that can be facilitated by the web. So looking and working with Cambridge and their Cybercrime Centre, they've got various data sets involving various aspects of cybercrime. They basically had a look to see, is this the case? Can we see additional traces of volume cybercrime? The answer was yes. They collect loads of interesting data. And again, they've put this down to people being stuck at home, being anxious, job losses, business closures. They still need to support themselves, so they may turn to cybercrime. And they have also recommended that, there probably needs to be some kind of change to policing practice as well. So you should probably have changes to how governments make announcements, how businesses secure their assets, and potentially how police are funded, which I'll get to. Moving away from the business side of things and to just citizens at home, there's been an increase in online shopping. At least shops have the high street has bounced back a bit, but there's still an awful lot of people shopping online. In the beginning, they did download unfamiliar software. As I said before, Zoom is an example. And still, many aspects of life have moved online, particularly when borders were closed and people couldn't visit relatives as easily, yet everybody was socialising online. So in terms of how to police cybercrime, what's the best approach going forward? So we actually have some pretty good examples in Scotland. One is Police Scotland work with the Scottish Business Resilience Centre. So they can help give businesses advice, which I think is a great model. There's been models in other places down south. So down in London, uniformed officers visit businesses to build up a relationship so that if there's any aspect of online crime, they actually would know who to turn to rather than being stuck as to who to contact. And Hampshire Constabulary have been working with Portsmouth University as well. In this kind of area, this was just pre-pandemic, but looking at how they would engage with the wider community. So again, if individuals at home had an issue with cybercrime, they would know who to contact. So particularly maybe the young people and the elderly as well, they may be more likely to fall victim to the likes of phishing attacks. So this type of engagement could complement wider initiatives by the police. So just to conclude, so societal change has been accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So one aspect that I think we need to look at going forward in terms of our new normal is that governments and the media really need to consider the messages that they're sending out, and to make it really, really clear, how these messages are going to be delivered and what people need to do with them. Because as I've shown you, criminals have basically piggybacked on the messages that have been sent out. If people weren't sure or there wasn't a lot of clarity, they were able to turn that into a phishing attack. So that needs to be clear. I think companies are actually doing a pretty good job of this. Reconsider what their security policies are and security infrastructure. I think companies are generally realizing that everybody is not going to be back in the office, and it's still going to be hybrid working for a long time to come, potentially permanently, I don't know. And for the policing side of things, they need appropriate funding to actually be able to deal with this volume cybercrime, because it's impacting individuals, people that you may know. It's not going to be a job for the big forces like NTA. It's going to be local police that needs to deal with that as a first point of contact, at least. So things are changing moving forward, and these are just some of the things that I think we need to consider. I mean, that's pretty much it for my talk. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to take any questions.
Lindsay, does your research break down across gender, BME, etc., or is it
So it was just very high level. It was basically what was reported in the media at the time. I think it would be quite interesting if they were able to break down a bit further. Trying to get hold of crime statistics from the police are difficult / almost impossible. But I think it would be an interesting thing to do.
The only reason I ask is that 90% of all the rooms taken today are white middle-aged men. So I'm interested to understand the demographic of interest on what next.
Yeah. I think that would be interesting to look into. I've got an honours student looking at demographics at the moment, so I'll be curious to see what she comes up with if she finds a correlation. I can't say the word correlation between different demographics and who can spot phishing messages. Yeah, good question.
It's kind of similar, but more in terms of device type. Is there any kind of research that shows whether people using a particular device, like a phone versus a laptop, is more likely to
Yeah, so in terms of the different devices and the likelihood of clicking on phishing messages, sometimes it can be the case with mobile devices. If you've got an iPhone, for example, and you get a phishing message, it doesn't always immediately show who it's from. You've kind of got to click on the name and then see if it looks like a legitimate address or not. The other part of that as well is, if people are on the go, it's a smaller screen. They might not be paying full attention and just go, yep, that seems legit, click on it, and that's it. And I think, because people are more likely to be on their mobile devices nowadays rather than sitting at a desktop machine, it may be more likely that they'll click on a mobile device.
Yeah.
Yep, sure.
Is there a breakdown between mobile and laptop, desktop?
I don't have a breakdown, but there is work that's been done in that space. I don't have the answers to that one today.
I was on a round table recently, we were talking about some of this type of stuff, especially around the volume cybercrime. And there certainly was a large proportion of people in the group saying, well, it's at the stage where it's almost beyond the police's ability to do this and manage it. So, there's a suggestion that, well, actually, the police shouldn't look into it, and people should get insurance against it, almost like car insurance. So you get insurance to say, well, for falling prone to cybercrime, getting your ID stolen and stuff like that.
Yes, I do see where you're coming from. Given, like you said, given the volume, it is, the police barely have enough resources as it is in some cases. To then expect them to deal with the mass amount of cybercrime that's currently ongoing is a huge challenge for them.
That was one of the driver was, actually, if they stopped dealing with all of this stuff, ultimately should be the responsibility of the individual anyway.
There's arguments for and against that.
But it then allows the police to retarget, to stop what the more serious crime things. But yeah, it was quite a heated debate, as I said.
I can imagine.
Is there any evidence to suggest that people are handling these attacks any better from a public perspective?
Not that I've seen. The only thing I have seen is that there was a figure recently of how many more emails have been reported to the NCSC, which is suggesting at least people are being able to identify some phishing emails and forward them on. But yeah, there's still too many people falling victim and losing money.
Lindsay, you quote a 600% increase in phishing. Is this because people are better stopping phishing, identifying phishing, or because we've got a whole bunch of people who are told to press a button and they're now actually doing it?
I mean, that was Google that detected that themselves. So it wasn't the end users that have reported that. I mean, I think people are getting better at reporting it, but there's still a huge problem.
Nicely broad brush answer there.
Yep.
I have two questions from the chat. Gavin Jarvie asks, as the future appears to be mobile and data, are companies taking steps to empower users in a way that gives them more visibility without fitting outside the scope of what they're intended for?
Like how their data is being used.
Something that flags to a user that, for example, Facebook or other such app is reading your wallet. I read that the US and Apple are working on digitizing passwords, hence the question.
So there's various bits of work being done to try and alert users as to what their data is being used for and how it's being used. I'd argue that in Europe, GDPR was part of that. I've done research in the past where I've looked at privacy policies and things that companies present. So, for example, we looked at the top 10 websites in the UK at the time, looked at their privacy policies and looked at how easy it was to understand. We ran it through some readability metrics, and I think one of them came back with it would take 26 years of education to be able to understand the privacy policy, and even with a PhD I don't have that. So the average people that have just are just finishing up high school, for example, would like to know where their data is going. They may not have a hope because it's full of legal terms. But there's certainly work being done. Basically, the design of notifications for security and privacy, for example, to see what users will engage with, to see how best to communicate how data is being used.
Dr. Catherine Smith asks, did your research indicate level of cyber exclusion both use COVID-related business change and targeting by criminals?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Did your research indicate level of cyber exclusion both due to COVID-related business change and targeting by criminals?
We didn't go that far in, which is a really short answer, sorry.
All right. Yeah, that's both of my questions here.
Any other questions? Thank you very much, folks. And I think